So today we have Susan Fletcher speaking to us. Susan serves as the Director of History and Archives for the Navigators and the historic Glen, Eyrie property down in Colorado Springs. In this role, she documents and interprets the history of the worldwide navigator movement alongside the local history of the Pikes Peak region. She's also the owner of a history, Joy Consulting, a public history consulting firm. She earned her MA in history from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Prior to being hired at the Navigators, almost 15 years ago, she served as the archivist for the Dixon Pentecostal Research Center in Lee University, where she documented the history of the Church of God denomination. She's the author of a number of books, including Exploring the History of Childhood and Play Through 50 Historic Treasuries, and the co-author of the Glen Eyrie story and Dawson Trotman in his own words. And she's got a new book coming out, The Light of Life for the City, about the First Presbyterian Church at 150 years. She's also involved in a number of community activities. And Susan, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you roll and explain to us about Glen Eyrie and Mr. Palmer.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's so exciting to be speaking to you all. I spoke to one of the Colorado Springs Rotary clubs right before the pandemic, so it's good to be with all of you today. I would like to just talk about 150 years of Glen Eyrie. So last year, Colorado Springs and Glen Eyrie both celebrated our sesquicentennial, our 150th birthday. And as part of that, we wrote a coffee table book, and we're doing kind of a history publicity campaign. So it's really exciting to be able to talk to all of you up in Fort Collins today. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can look at a PowerPoint. All right, hopefully you guys can see my screen.
Yeah, perfect.
All right. A large eagle's nest on a rugged cliffside inspired the name of Glen Eyrie, Valley of the Eagle's Nest. According to a Denver newspaper in 1871, Glen Eyrie is, quote, a wild, romantic spot, and nothing but a romantic turn of mind would have prompted any human creature to build a costly habitation in such a place. It is simply a little opening or park of a few acres, with a few mountains rising abruptly on the west, and the vast monuments and ledges of the rocks on every hand worn and chiseled by time into 100 fantastic figures. This is a photo overlooking the Glen Eyrie Valley. You guys might recognize Pikes Peak is right there in the back. And Glen Eyrie runs adjacent to Garden of the Gods. So down in the lower right-hand corner, you have some of the iconic red rock formations that we have down here in Colorado Springs. Stone hearths and fire rings in nearby Garden of the Gods indicate human presence adjacent to Glen Eyrie for at least the last 3,000 years. Indigenous people were present in the Glen Eyrie region long before General William Jackson Palmer arrived on the scene in 1869. Historian Leah Davis Witherow writes, for the Ute, this is their ancestral homeland. Culturally and historically, this is their place of being. In addition to Utes, many other tribes had ties to the region, including the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. As a cultural crossroads, the iconic red rocks at nearby Garden of the Gods served as a landmark and meeting place for some of these tribes. According to Witherow, as a result of Western settlement, the indigenous people of the Pikes Peak region were removed from a place where they had been for hundreds and thousands of years. Today, despite forced relocation, many Native Nation people live in the Pikes Peak region and have ongoing influence in the story of this area and in the story of Glen Eyrie and the city. Let's jump ahead in time to 1830s. William Jackson Palmer was born to Matilda Jackson and John Palmer on September 17, 1836 on Kinsdale Farm in Delaware, and this is a picture of the farm. They moved to Pennsylvania when William was young. According to historian Donald McGilchrist, Palmer was described as somewhat stiff and reserved on the outside, but good-humored and kind in his heart. He had a remarkable persistence, a determination to build a neat, trim, happy, and sensible world. He possessed not only persistence, but energy and vision. Palmer joined the Civil War in 1869. He joined the Union Army and commanded the 15th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry. In March 1865, President Abraham Lincoln confirmed Palmer for appointment to the brevet grade of Brigadier General. So he was the second youngest Brigadier General in the Civil War. After the war ended, he returned to a career in the railroad industry. In 1867, he joined the Kansas Pacific Railroad to survey possible routes throughout the Southwest. While he was on the train, writing these lines, in 1869, he met a beautiful 19-year-old woman named Mary Lincoln Mellon. Her nickname was Queen and was known as Queen for the rest of her life. The striking beauty intrigued Palmer, and he wanted to know more about her. She had been given her nickname in childhood. She had been born on March 26, 1850, in Kentucky. She was a bright, tender-hearted young woman who loved art and music. And during their conversation aboard the train, Palmer fell in love with her. After their journey, they met back up and had a sweet courtship and were soon engaged. In the middle of this romance, Palmer encountered the Pikes Peak region for the first time, while on a survey mission for the Kansas Pacific Railroad. In July 1869, he rode atop a carriage in the warm night air on his way to Colorado City. He awoke from a nap to find the bright moonlight illuminating the summit of Pikes Peak. His party camped for the night, and they explored the area the next day. They enjoyed the stunning rock formations of Garden of the Gods, the towering mountains, and the fresh summer air. Palmer ventured into the rugged valley immediately to the north of the famous rock formations, and he fell in love with the valley and determined that he was going to live out the rest of his days there. He had a plan to establish a summer colony where all of his friends would live. He wrote his vision to his fiancée Queen, telling her that he was certain there would soon be a famous resort near the finest springs of soda and the most enticing scenery at the confluence of Fountain and Monument Creeks. He shared plans to build a narrow-gauge railroad running from Denver to Mexico. Palmer was excited to share his future in the Pikes Peak area with his fiancée Queen. The pair of them married in November 1870, and they honeymooned in England. And as part of their honeymoon, rather than having fun and relaxing, Palmer spent most of his time fundraising for his colony and his railroad. After their honeymoon, they returned to the United States, and Palmer came out west to start building their home, as well as establishing the city of Colorado Springs. So this is a picture of the very first house that they built in Glen, Eyrie. This was late 1871, finished in 1872. Palmer hired Greeley-based architect J.L. White and builder L. Whipple to design and construct a house at Glen, Eyrie. Unfortunately, this was the middle of winter. Construction wasn't going as fast as they thought, so when Queen arrived, she didn't have a place to live. Palmer asked his father-in-law to obtain tents from the government's second-hand store that were left over from the Great Chicago Fire, so his new bride would have a place to live. So she arrives in October 1871, along with her parents and her in-laws, and they live in these tents. And eventually, the carriage house on the property was finished first, so they moved into the upper stories of that house. And then at last, in 1872, this home is finished. The original home is 3.5 stories tall with a full basement, a Gothic structure in the form of a cross. Apparently, Queen had requested the unique octagonal rooms, which are a little bit hard to see in this picture, but on the back side of the house, there are some octagonal rooms. They also had channeled water from the creek into the house, so they had indoor running water. And for a home located so remotely on the frontier, this was quite the feat of engineering. Palmer kept a demanding travel schedule, overseeing the work of the Denver and Rio Grande. The couple had their first child in 1872, a daughter named Elsie. And along with Elsie, Queen's half-siblings lived at the property during those days. In the mid-1870s, visitor Grace Greenwood reported that children are everywhere, on the hillside, by the brookside, under the bridge, in the canyon, about the barn, and all over the house. This is a picture of Elsie in front of the Glen. On the right-hand side is a picture of Palmer's Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. In 1878, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad got into a railroad war with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe over passage rights through the Royal Gorge. The conflict exploded into an armed standoff, which eventually made its way deep into the court system and took several years to resolve. Palmer feared that the Santa Fe's men might kidnap Elsie on her way to school, so he built her a schoolhouse on the property, and that's the building that she is sitting in front of on the left. Eventually, the court battle reached all the way to the Supreme Court, which settled the dispute in 1880. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe got rights to Raton Pass, and the Denver and Rio Grande could build in the Royal Gorge. And if you take the train through the Royal Gorge today, near Canyon City, that's still on the train tracks that the Denver and Rio Grande had built. With the stress of the Railroad War finally over, Palmer decided to remodel their house for the first time in 1881. They added an octagonal room with a tower in the back, so you can see the back of the house there. They also added beautiful gardens and a conservatory and a series of fountains. However, the family's fortunes would soon change again. After suffering a heart attack in 1880, at the age of 34, Queen's health grew increasingly worse. She tried for a time to still live at home at Glen Eyrie, and at that time she had had two more daughters. Dorothy was the middle and Marjorie is the youngest. Eventually, Queen decides that she is going to permanently settle in England. So she leaves William here in Colorado and moves to England. Here's a picture of her daughters. Queen had an active social life in England, and she knew the luminary artists of the day, including John Singer Sargent, who would eventually paint a portrait of Elsie when she turned 17. In 1894, Queen grew weaker and passed away on December 27, 1894, from pneumonia and heart failure. She was only 44 years old. Devastated over the loss of his beloved wife, General Palmer brought his daughters home to Colorado Springs. And in early 1885, the quartet arrived and settled into their new life at Glen Eyrie. Here's a picture of Queen in the years leading up to her death. The healing beauty and fresh air of the Glen was just what the grieving Palmer family needed after Queen passed away. General Palmer and his daughters took long hikes through Garden of the Gods, and the girls enjoyed picnics on the lawn and cooling off from the summer heat by waiting in Camp Creek. In 1901, General Palmer sold the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. After retiring, Palmer decided to transform his wooden frame house at the Glen into a beautiful stone manor. It was time to turn Glen Eyrie into a place that rivaled the country homes of the wealthy industrialists of the day. He hired construction manager Edmund Van Diest, along with a team of architects and craftspeople to make his vision a reality. And here you can see some of the elevation drawings or blueprint drawings of what they were proposing as they were remodeling the home. The stunning transformation of Glen Eyrie turned the estate into one of the most spectacular homes in the West. There was a drawing room, a dining room, a library, a den, all of which were on the first floor. Beyond the dining room were the famous Glen Eyrie kitchens, a flower arranging room, a butler's pantry, and a valet room. There was also a brand new library wing. So if you see, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but the library wing is at the back of the structure on the left-hand side. General Palmer decided he needed a great hall that would also house all of his books. And so this would become where he would have large gatherings. The home was one of the first residences in Colorado to have electricity, which Palmer generated himself at his new electric plant and powerhouse across the valley. So he was trying to make this estate as self-sufficient as possible. He also installed a pasteurization plant to purify the milk from the Glen Eyrie dairy. At the time, his youngest daughter Marjorie had tuberculosis, and they were trying to prevent the spread of the disease and were trying to prevent the spread of tuberculosis via unpasteurized milk. The carriage house sheltered 10 vehicles with a coach room. They also had built-in bathtubs for General Palmer's dogs and stables for the horses. As a former cavalry officer, General Palmer took great pride in his horses and in his ability to ride all over the region. Tragically, the beautiful future that you probably imagine if you decide to spend $1 million renovating your home was cut short. On October 27, 1906, the unthinkable happened. General Palmer was paralyzed in a riding accident. Miraculously, he would live for another 2.5 years. By the spring of 1909, General Palmer's health had begun a final decline, and he passed away in March of 1909. In the years to follow, Glen Eyrie changed ownership numerous times. From 1909 to 1916, the daughters and Edmund Van Diest tried to figure out what to do with the property. Then there's General Palmer before his death. One of the ways that they tried to utilize the property was by renting it out to a girls' day camp. So we have some campers in the Rotarian audience today. These are your predecessors from like 1909, from over 100 years ago. They were playing baseball. The campers enjoyed riding horses, doing gymnastics near the Rose Garden, and hiking. There was also a film that was made at Glen Eyrie by director Romaine Fielding. Eventually, they decided to sell the property, and they advertised the estate's charms. In addition to the core valley, the Glen Eyrie property also included the old Chambers Ranch to the south of Garden of the Gods, which Palmer had purchased in 1900. And today, that property is the Rockledge Ranch Living History Village. In 1916, a syndicate of investors from Oklahoma purchased the property. They wanted to establish the Glen Eyrie Company and intended to subdivide the valley into miniature luxury villas. However, this was all happening in 1917 and 1918 when the First World War was happening. This plan was not financially viable when people were distracted by the war in Europe and by their sons getting sent over to fight. So they were relieved when another buyer offered to take the property off their hands in 1918. This is a picture of one of the villas that they were proposing. The buyer who offered to take the property off their hands was a man named Alexander Cochran, who was apparently one of the wealthiest and most eligible bachelors in America. He purchased the Glen in 1918 for $450,000. After a stormy marriage to Polish opera singer Ganna Walska, and with failing health, Cochran decided to sell Glen Eyrie. So they held a public auction in 1927. These are the two parcels of land that he was trying to sell. And the yellow portion is the main core of Glen Eyrie, which you can see just above like the notch with the words in red. He also had acquired a lot of land up to the north as well, which you can see in the green up above. With the exception of a few remaining staff members, the Glen Eyrie estate sat mostly empty for almost a decade. This is a picture of the 1927 auction and an interior shot of the Great Hall at Glen Eyrie. People packed the property. They were packed the inside of the castle. We also have a picture of thousands of people just cramming the lawns, trying to figure out who was going to own this special treasure. Unfortunately, the person who won the bid failed to actually pay any money on this, and so the property remains with Cochran's holding company well after his death. So finally, in 1938, George and Susan Strake of Houston, Texas, purchased Glen Eyrie for $200,000. Now, you might notice that this is $250,000 less than what Cochran had paid for it in 1918. This is primarily because the estate is falling into disrepair. It's been sitting empty. They just really, really want this to be, people just really want anybody to own this at this point. George Strake was the owner of Strake Petroleum of Houston and had an adventurous early life discovering the Conroe oil fields in Texas. The multimillionaire family intended to use Glen Eyrie as a summer home to escape the Houston heat and humidity. let's go back. The young Strike family enjoyed all the delights of Glen Eyrie. They went camping in the mountains. They apparently brought in buffalo for their children to ride, and they just enjoyed bringing the family up every summer. Tragically, these fun times are also not to last. In the late spring of 1947, the blissful 9 years that the family spent at their summer home came to a sudden end when a cloudburst sent a catastrophic flood down Queens Canyon, overflowing the banks of Camp Creek and submerging much of Glen Eyrie. The insurance company put the salvage price of the estate at only $100,000. Although Strake spent the next 6 years working to repair the damage, he eventually decided to sell the property in 1953 at a listing price of $500,000. Meanwhile, the Navigators, a California church, a California-based ministry organization, was looking for a new home. Founded in 1933 by Dawson Trotman as a ministry to sailors, the Navigators were outgrowing their downtown Los Angeles offices. While the Navigators searched for a new home, their friend, Reverend Billy Graham, decided to buy a property to use as a retreat center or training academy. The two ministries entered a deal to buy land together. Dawson Trotman visited Colorado Springs in 1953, and Springs real estate agent Gus Hill brought the property to his attention. So they agreed that they were going to buy this together, and the Navigators and the Billy Graham organization were supposed to buy this together. When the Strakes learned that two ministries were interested in owning Glen Eyrie, they reduced the asking price to $300,000 plus $40,000 for furnishings. In the end, Reverend Graham's organization decided that owning a large property would be a distraction from the work of ministry crusades. And so the Navigators were left with the option to buy all by themselves. There were only 6 weeks left on the option to buy and required a deposit of $110,000, which far exceeded the ministry's annual budget. However, the Navigators launched a very successful fundraising campaign made up mostly of very small donations, and they were able to purchase Glen Eyrie in September of 1953. So since 1953, the Navigators have stewarded the legacy of this beautiful property. At Glen Eyrie, we promise to stay true to our Navigator legacy by purposefully and thoughtfully inspiring wonder through our hospitality, nurturing of guests, and then the natural beauty of creation. In this place of breathtaking grandeur, we create a uniquely sacred environment that opens the heart, mind, and soul to moments of reflection, discovery, heartening change, and genuine personal transformation, bringing our guests closer to what truly matters. So if any of you would like to visit or participate at Life at Glen Eyrie, you have a number of ways to do that. We have daily tours, which you can schedule through our tour office. You're also welcome to come for high tea. Well, it's not high tea, it's just afternoon tea. We have afternoon tea almost every day. We also have a number of concerts, public events that you can come to. You can also participate in a conference that we have. The Navigators purchased Glen Eyrie for the sake of having conferences, and so we have ministry conferences, but we also host writers' retreats. Outside organizations will often rent out the property to hold business meetings and their own conventions. And lastly, you can also stay overnight at Glen Eyrie. You can stay overnight in the castle itself, which is the building that you see down on the right-hand corner of the screen. We also have a number of modern lodges as well. So I would love to answer questions if we have time. So we all hope that you will eventually make the drive down I-25 and come see us down here at Glen Eyrie.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions? What's the process for tours, Susan?
So you would call our tour office. You can visit our website at gleneyrie.org, and they should either have an online reservation form or you can call the phone number and you can get yourself set up for a tour. One of our volunteer tour guides will give you a tour of the property.
Fabulous, thank you. Anybody else? Okay,
All
wonderful.
right.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Yeah,
Thank you so
thank
much.
you.